Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And in the second half of this episode, we will talk about the many, many developments happening in the world. For example, the ceasefire that's just been announced as we're recording this episode between Israel and Lebanon, which has been announced by Donald Trump. But first of all, that big breaking story that Chris has been working on in Westminster Thursday afternoon and Thursday evening. Chris, it's the return of the Lord Mandelson, ex-ambassador to Washington story, and who knew what when about his appointment. Bring us up to date.
Exactly that. So let me walk you through what happened this afternoon and then into this evening. So just after 3:00 this afternoon, The Guardian, Pippa Crerar, their political editor and their investigations team, dropped a couple of stories relating to Lord Mandelson and the whole business of his appointment as ambassador to Washington. You'll remember that in the end he was sacked, and it's caused the Prime Minister no end of grief. So in those stories, around about 3:00, The Guardian said that Lord Mandelson had failed a key element of the vetting process that was undertaken around his appointment. But the Foreign Office decided that it was going to, if you like, reject that advice, and the government was going to crack on with the process of appointing him anyway. And of course, Lord Mandelson then did go out to Washington and do the job for a while. So we then had a period of the best part of 3 hours in which opposition parties, Conservatives, Reform, Liberal Democrats and others, were coming out and saying, the Prime Minister has misled us, including misleading the House of Commons. And if you do that and do that on purpose, that is seen as a resignation issue, because there's various clips floating around. You may have seen them on social media or elsewhere of the Prime Minister talking about the vetting process. And so I assembled a piece for the 6:00 news on the telly, and I had a sneaking suspicion. Nobody had told me this, but it was just a sneaking suspicion that before 6:00, and probably just before 6:00, Downing Street or government might get round to saying something that might change the terms of this story. And sure enough,
they did.
In the time it took me to walk from our newsroom to our balcony where I report live for the 6:00 news, a text appears in my WhatsApps, and sure enough, the government is saying neither the Prime Minister nor any government minister was aware that Peter Mandelson was granted developed vetting against the advice of UK security vetting until earlier this week. In other words, he didn't know, which then, of course, poses the rather significant question of why did he not know? Why was he insufficiently curious to find out about what the vetting process around a appointment of a colourful and controversial character might have concluded?
Although I suppose that statement sort of protects the Prime Minister from his point of view about the allegations that he misled Parliament.
Completely, absolutely.
Because he didn't know.
Because he says, and they've said it explicitly and on the record and categorically, that the Prime Minister didn't know. So yes, the criticism is already coming along the lines of, well, why didn't you know and why were you not more curious? But if you like, I suppose that is a second order critique relative to one where they were not able to say that statement because it wasn't true, where politicians would say, well, hang on a minute, you have misled us and knowingly misled us. Whereas given what he is saying, he can say, well, actually, I didn't know. I suspect we'll have him in the House of Commons on Monday, formally updating the House and acknowledging that, he wasn't able to share the full facts because he wasn't in possession of the full facts at the time.
And we already know from all those emails and documents that have been released as a result of the Conservative motion in Parliament a few months ago about the Mandelson appointment, that actually one of the big themes of those documents was the PM not really being very involved after the point at which he said, let's get this guy in to be our new man in Washington.
Quite. And I think in many senses it would appear that this is a further case study or further evidence that burnishes that wider argument that the Prime Minister was insufficiently involved, that it was outsourced to others. And then the whole thing, of course, very much blew up in his face. You know, this has been the politically most consequential decision of Keir Starmer's time in Downing Downing Street. It was a appointment of choice, normally a senior ambassadorial appointment, let alone the most prominent of them all, ambassador in Washington, is a career civil servant. They have political, if you like, detachment and distance from any prime minister. They're probably less likely to be caught up in some swirling political row. And instead, the decision was taken to appoint Peter Mandelson, who had, left various government jobs in the past with all sorts of clouds hovering over him, was seen to be one heck of a political operator, but also seen to come with a fair amount of baggage. Out he goes. And then the whole thing blows up, and it blows up spectacularly in the Prime Minister's face. And of course, we know that this isn't the end of it, because we are waiting the next, is it tranche of documents to come from this process that Parliament has demanded of the government to publish loads of stuff connected to the appointment of Lord Mandelson. We were waiting for that already, and we've just had another chapter of it. And just one extra detail, which newscasters will be keen to hear, which is The Guardian reported that, and I think this is key, The Guardian reported that there was a conversation going on in government as to whether or not they would have to disclose this failure in vetting to Parliament as a result of a disclosure of all of these documents. Now, it seems to me that is quite key in what might have brought this to light at this point. I have no idea who the Guardian sources are, and of course the Guardian will be scrupulous in protecting their sources, absolutely rightly, as any journalist should be. But that seems key, I would have thought, to what could, I'm speculating, but what could have motivated some to decide that this ought to see the light of day.
But then and so just to be clear, Downing Street have said the first that the Prime Minister knew about this failed vetting was this week.
Yes.
So in the last few days.
Completely that. So earlier this week is the quote. So I guess that's presumably, without those words doing a lot of work, any day this week prior to today. Now, whether that coincided with...
Thank you for explaining
I know,
calendar, right? But I know, but that's the thing. We have to use the language to work out when they knew, don't we?
Completely. Yes. I know that sounds
because if he'd learnt yesterday, they would have said he only learnt yesterday.
Well, possibly. Yeah, possibly. Or you go for a slightly vaguer formulation. Or earlier this week, it would be a struggle, I think, to imply earlier this week if it was earlier today, even though technically that was earlier this week. Was that, and again, I'm speculating now, but was that when The Guardian approached them and said, this is a story we're intending to run and do you want to say anything about it? Or was it as a result of something else? We don't know. But in essence, they're saying, look, we only found out this week. Separately from that, I hear that David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister and former Foreign Secretary, only found out about this today. Now, the statement said no government minister, but that's being made clear. I also understand that Lord Mandelson himself did not know any of this until today. He'd gone through the vetting process. There were no further questions or follow-ups, and then he was appointed, and all the rest of it. So plenty of those who you might have assumed would have known about what we have discovered today, courtesy of The Guardian's reporting, are saying that they didn't know. There's others who are yet to reply to us, but that's kind of where we are as we record this edition of Newscast.
So if no ministers knew, including up to the Prime Minister and including the Foreign Secretary at the time, David Lammy, who do we think did know?
Well, we don't know, is the honest answer. I mean, it seems to me that, now, clearly some folk in the Foreign Office knew, and you would assume that senior folk in and around the upper echelons of government would have known. But as I say, we don't know. So who knew what and when, and why did they choose not to tell others, is a very live and relevant question, but we don't know the answers to those questions.
And Chris, before you came into the Newscast satellite studio at Westminster, I hear you were interviewing Dame Emily Thornberry, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, a Labour MP. She does a good line in exasperation, but she's turned the exasperation up to about 15, I hear, in this interview.
She does do a good line in exasperation, and she was absolutely exasperated. She had with her a letter, which is out there, it's in public, between the committee and the Foreign Office, where they asked lots of questions around the whole process of Peter Mandelson's appointment. But they also asked specific questions, like, were there any concerns raised, and this is not a verbatim quote, but the essence of it, were any concerns raised in the vetting process? And they got kind of non-answers. She was saying to me...
let's hear her. The newscasters
great.
can hear the exasperation for themselves.
We're so fed up. We had the people in front of us, we asked them questions, and they've just been taking the mickey out of us. They asked us, we gave them direct questions and they half answered it, but they missed out the bit that was important. So they said, oh yes, there was direct vetting, and at the end of it, he was appointed. They missed out the bit saying he didn't pass the vetting. They missed that bit out. I mean, being at our most generous, it wasn't a full answer. There is a question about whether it was misleading, and was it deliberately misleading? I mean, this is appalling.
And I suppose, Chris, apart from that clip being quite entertaining to hear Emily Thornberry's eye roll, is that it keeps the focus on what happened in the Foreign Office at official level.
Yeah, completely. I mean, she said to me just after we'd finished, in a colourful turn of phrase, that it would be a bit like you arriving at work in the morning, saying to your colleagues, because you're a bit sweaty, that you've run all the way from home, but failing to tell them it was because you were being chased by a bear. In other words, that sort of sense that there was some sharp questions and direct questions asked by the committee, and the answers completely ducked what the wider machine, at the very least, knew to be the case.
When I was listening to Radio 4 on Wednesday afternoon, and you were being interviewed by Evan Davis, who introduced you as the BBC's legendary political editor, by the way. I don't know if you heard that bit.
I blushed.
And then you gave an amazing quote you received from a minister about the government taking ages to do things. I think that deserves an even wider audience because it was such a good quote.
Oh, so yes. So I was telling a story, Adam, about a conversation I'd had with a minister about their frustrations at getting stuff done and the kind of gummed up nature of the governing system, if you like. And this person said to me that they feared that if they keeled over at work, what would then happen would be a consultation process, which would last for 12 weeks. There would then be 17 people involved in signing off what to do next, including the permanent secretary, the most senior figure in the department. At that point, it would be authorised that an ambulance could be called, and by then the minister would be stone dead. That was the colourful description, exasperated description around, some of the processes of getting things done in a complex and advanced Western democracy.
Well, Chris Mason, quote, getting machined. Thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
So that's the situation at Westminster at 8 p.m. as we finish recording this bit of Newscast. Here's how we do a bit of podcasting time jumping, because before I spoke to Chris, I got the situation in the rest of the world from two very good friends of the Newscast podcast. And we sat down together just after 7 o'clock, just after Donald Trump had been standing outside the White House announcing to the world that he had negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. Of course, there was a lot more to it than that, as I discussed with two friends of Newscast. And we're now recording this half of this episode of Newscast at about 7:10 on Thursday night. And here with me in the studio is Jane Corbin from Panorama. Hello, Jane.
Hello, Adam.
And Chief North America correspondent Gary O'Donoghue, not on a screen outside the White House, but here in person. Welcome.
And it's lovely to be here.
And just as we're recording, I noticed you were listening to Donald Trump making some remarks.
Again.
Well, yeah, when has he ever not? But he was responding to the breaking news on Thursday evening, that there is going to be a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. What was Trump saying, and how does this fit into his, well, I was going to say his grand plan, but that's...
Well, actually, I think this has been a real problem. So this is a serious development for him because
It was a central part of what Iran wanted out of the negotiations. There was a disagreement, misunderstanding, whatever you want to call it, about whether it was part of the Iran ceasefire. And so to get this, I think, has removed one of those big stumbling blocks to any kind of future negotiations in the next few days between the US and Iran. So I think it's incredibly important. I will say, of course, that, Israel isn't fighting Lebanon per se, it's fighting Hezbollah. And Israel has just said in the last few minutes that it plans to stay inside South Lebanon. It's like 10K inside, isn't it? So, that's not going to change. So we'll see what the reality of that ceasefire is on the ground. But he's also invited the Lebanese president and Netanyahu to the White House, which would be pretty historic, I think.
And Jane, how does this just fit into the bigger picture of kind of all the fires that Trump is fighting at the moment?
You mean in terms of Iran?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's the big fire, isn't it? And we've had this negotiation that went on in Pakistan, which seemed to break up, but I never thought it had. I mean, they'd spent 20 odd hours, and it was obvious that it was going to continue behind the scenes. And that's actually what's been happening. The ceasefire is still in place. There's still discussions, and there's optimism, I think, that J.D. Vance again will become involved with the Iranians at a high level, and those talks will resume. And as Gary said, in order to get that ceasefire to extend and to talk about the nitty-gritty issues like the nuclear issue and the Straits of Hormuz, they had to sort out this continuing exchange of rocket and drone fire between Hezbollah and Israel. So it looks as if that's happened with a 10-day ceasefire, and it looks as if Hezbollah is going to abide by it. I mean, they've actually been hammered very, very hard in the last day or so in one of their strongholds in southern Lebanon by Israel in Bint Jbeil, and the last remaining bridge that connects north and south Lebanon has been destroyed. So they're really in a tight corner. But it remains to be seen whether they will agree to this in the long term if Israel, as they've said tonight, is not prepared to withdraw out of Lebanon, but to retain this 10-kilometre security zone, which is effectively a buffer zone for Israel.
And the Pakistanis have also been working incredibly hard on getting another round of these negotiations. Not just the army chief in touring, going to Tehran, but like the Prime Minister's going through a whole bunch of countries in the Middle East at the moment. They are putting in some serious effort to try and make this happen. I think a lot of people are pretty glad that they're being able to be some sort of negotiator in the middle of this, and a lot of people are putting a lot of hopes on their efforts.
I've just realised I've done the thing that quite often happens in these situations where that Lebanon's sort of treated a bit like a subplot, whereas for the people who live in Lebanon, it's not a subplot at all. It's another chapter grim chapter after a lot of other grim chapters.
And more than 2,000 people dead. In the latest round of fighting, as you said, there's always... poor Lebanon's always stuck in the middle. BBC Verify is reporting that at least 1,400 buildings have been destroyed in southern Lebanon. This is effectively a wasteland, and Lebanon is once again in the crosshairs. It's not a subplot. It's very, very important for the people of Lebanon, and very important, I think, for the president himself, because Trump had hoped to get Netanyahu and Aoun, the president of Lebanon, to have a direct phone call. That didn't happen. And instead, Trump had to take the stage and probably was pleased to take the stage and announce this ceasefire. But, it's a big thing for Lebanon. It's technically still a criminal act for a Lebanese to be in touch with an Israeli. There are no relations between them, no diplomatic relations. And it's 34 years since there was last a meeting at that level. And we know that Trump did manage to bring together the Lebanese ambassador in Washington and the Israeli ambassador in Washington for these talks that have led now to this ceasefire. But Lebanon's really on a knife edge here because they've got to handle Hezbollah. And what that means at the end of the day, as far as President Trump is concerned and Israel is concerned, but not Iran, is to disarm Hezbollah. And that really is a very big task. And that will be the sticking point on that particular track of the negotiations.
And also, Jane, I think it's worth reminding newscasters about the size of and the significance of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Like, we're not just talking about a small armed group here. It's much more significant than that.
Thousands and thousands of fighters. Israel claims to have killed 1,700 or so in this particular round of fighting. And of course, the population of Lebanon, 30% of Lebanon roughly, is Shia. And when the recent polls have been done and asking people within the Shia population, because Hezbollah is a Shia militia, if they support them or not. Their support is still running high at about between 80 and 90% of the Shia population, which is a third of the Lebanese population, support Hezbollah. So that's why it's very difficult for the Lebanese president, he happens to be a Christian, to try to sort of make this happen when quite a substantial part of his own population is pro-Hezbollah, though it also has to be said that the Lebanese overall are pretty fed up this time. They feel that it was Hezbollah that fired rockets and drones at Israel on March the 2nd. Israel responded. They feel that Hezbollah has pulled them into this very damaging and destructive and terribly devastating phase of fighting with 2,000 people dead at the end of it.
And then, Gary, zooming out to the conflict in the Gulf and the Middle East more widely, Donald Trump clearly doing a little mini victory lap tonight on Thursday night with this ceasefire for Lebanon.
Number 10, he said, by the way.
Well, yes, because it's another conflict. He has ended, even though some people say he's quite instrumental in keeping this one going.
Get it done. He wants this to be seen as his 10th victory rather than his 9th, which it was up till now. He's saying, get it done. Get it done.
I mean, do the White House feel like the war is going their way?
I mean, I think it's... they are facing some significant opposition at home from parts of their support that was otherwise loyal. And that's not entirely surprising because, a lot of his supporters thought that America First meant, a return to kind of traditional isolationism. And there's been some very vocal people who are not happy about that. Having said that, I mean, I was in Alabama the other day talking to traditional MAGA supporters down there. And for the time being, it seemed to me that, amongst evangelicals who I spoke to, amongst like farming communities, guys at a ball game we were talking to, there's a kind of, they're giving him the benefit of the doubt just now. But as one of the pastors said to me at a church, he said, yeah, they believe it now, but things can change in an instant. He said, remember Vietnam, remember Iraq. And that's the problem that even Donald Trump faces, which is that, in a democracy, public opinion matters. And that's in some ways the weakness of democracies, that governments are at the mercy of public opinion. And if it swings against them, it can swing against them big time. And that can cause huge problems for even for someone like Donald Trump.
But I suppose with this conflict, with most wars, right, there's a winner or a loser, and you can sort of point to who has won and who has lost and who's achieved their objectives and who's compromised the most to end the conflict. But we're now in a world where Donald Trump can sort of call his own result.
Yeah, and he tries to create this reality on the ground. This ceasefire is an example. Apparently, the Israeli Security Cabinet was still meeting when he announced it.
So it's almost like he just
they
decided
were scrambled,
apparently
5 minutes before it was due to be announced. So let's have to tell the cabinet.
Exactly. So sort of suggesting it was imposed on them rather than an organic process.
Absolutely.
And he did something. He did similar things, didn't he? With when he announced the ceasefire, that was pretty. It wasn't clear that Israel immediately signed up to that. So with Iran. So, these things, if you say it loud enough and long enough, it can become true. And certainly he believes he has sufficient willpower to do that and sufficient clout to do that. And then you announce that you're inviting them all to the White House. How can they turn it down? So he knows how to put the pressure on in that sense. But sometimes it doesn't stick. And of course, the 2 week ceasefire in terms of the Iran side of this runs out next Tuesday. And he's just said on the tarmac, or just before getting on to Marine One there, that if there isn't a deal, then probably we'll start bombing again.
And, neither Trump nor Netanyahu have fulfilled their war aims. I mean, we know there have been quite a lot of war aims and they have tended to shift. But for both of them, very loudly stated, regime change, especially for Benjamin Netanyahu, but also for Trump in the early days. And the other is solving the problem of the nuclear issue, what happens to 440 kilograms of enriched uranium. And for both of them, that's a key war aim. Neither of those things, certainly regime hasn't changed, although President Trump does say there are new people, but effectively they are the same. It's the same structure.
It's a more extreme structure,
it may well
right?
be.
Yeah.
I saw it described as regime editing by one
that
commentator.
was
quite a good way of putting it.
Yeah, or changing the regime rather than regime change.
Yeah.
Anyway, so neither Trump nor Netanyahu have achieved their war aims. So back to, as Gary says, what happens next Tuesday, they do have to deliver something on that. That's not something the public will forget. Everybody knows what those stated war aims were, and everybody's going to measure what happens against that.
I mean, it's bewildering, and I don't blame people at home if they're a bit sort of confused, because, it's not 10 days since Donald Trump did an interview where he said, when he was asked about the uranium, he says, I don't care about that. He literally said, I don't care about that. It's buried underground.
It's just some dust.
Just some dust.
That we can monitor from space.
Yeah, but now it's absolutely central.
Totally
so, sometimes, and certainly I feel this in what I do, sometimes you bend over backwards, maybe too far backwards, to kind of impose a kind of coherence, rationality on this. Maybe it's not there always.
I suppose that there are facts on the ground that we can observe.
We can.
It's just a sort of bigger narrative that he tends to sort of write for himself. Let's talk about another conflict, so that does involve Donald Trump. Is there a Trump versus Vance thing going on, Gary?
Well, I mean, it's true to say that if you're the vice president and in any circumstance, and there's you're 2 years out from an election, you are, unless you've really messed it up, you're probably the front runner for the nomination. You certainly have massive fundraising advantages, etc., etc. And who knows whether or not Donald Trump getting JD Vance involved in this Iran thing was a way of sort of reining him in a little bit, particularly because we know he's not been all that keen on this war. But the vice president is pretty loyal, and maybe he's prepared to take a bit of the flack for this. And if he can get a deal with the Iranians, then it's a sort of an advantage to him going forward. So there's upsides and downsides. I can't really see many upsides, though, for the vice president or the president getting in a fight with the Pope, which is also what they've both done in the last
We'll come on
week.
into that in a second. But yeah, Jane, your take on JD, because I was suggesting to you before we started recording that JD Vance had been given this a hospital pass. I then checked what hospital pass actually is to make sure I understood what it was.
Oh, it is.
Because it's basically in American football when you get thrown the ball, but designed in a way where you might really injure
in the Premier
yourself.
League as well.
Sorry, we have it
in the Premier League.
This is not my.
Badly.
This is not my. I'm much more an expert in international diplomacy than I am any sports. But Jane, you don't buy the hospital pass theory.
I don't. I mean, Gary's right. It could be that Trump wants to bind JD Vance into whatever happens in this war, whatever mess it ends up being, or success, because it's well known he wasn't keen. Vance wasn't keen. But I think it was really important to have JD Vance turning up in Pakistan. I think it was Air Force 2 he took, rather than Air Force 1, landing in Pakistan. Someone at that level meeting the Iranian delegation, and they sent the Speaker of their Parliament. That sent very strong signals. This was serious. These negotiations were serious. And when JD Vance left, I never thought that was the end of it. I mean, talked on Newscast at the weekend saying you can't expect it all to happen in a day. The fact that it doesn't break down and people don't leave in anger, but they leave without saying very much. But we didn't achieve what we wanted, but that's not the end of it. And I think JD Vance is critical to that, actually. I think that he was important that someone of that stature was sent. So not sure it was a hospital pass, but as you said, Gary, you can't always apply rationality to these things.
But then just to go back to the idea of the fight with the Pope, because I mean, that then also gets folded into the Trump-Vance relationship, because Vance is Catholic and there are loads of pictures.
Been on a long journey to get there, but he is a Catholic.
Well, and he went on a journey to the Vatican to meet the Pope, of which there's lots of pictures, and that's sort of been folded into a whole is Donald Trump picking a fight with the Pope?
Oh, he has just again, by the way. It's just in
another one.
Yeah. He's had another go at the Pope while he was on the, preparing to.
What did he say this time?
Oh, I mean, it's very interesting because JD Vance said the other day, Pope should be really careful when he, talks about theology. And you think, well, actually, that is the Pope's job.
Yeah.
To put theology and sort of theological justifications for war and whatever. But Donald Trump is saying, the Pope has a right to his opinions, but he has a right to criticize him. Of course, if you're one of the 52 million American Catholics, you don't think the Pope just has opinions. You think he's the vicar of Christ, right? He is literally Christ's representative. So despite having increased his support amongst American Catholics, and they are sizable and they vote, Donald Trump is running the risk of seriously alienating them, in the same way also seriously alienating the evangelicals by posing memes of him pretending to be Christ.
Although he says he was being a doctor.
Well, take a look for yourself.
And Jane, I suppose in a sort of world historical view, it's a reminder that popes actually have been very political on the world stage. And maybe we've just got used to the idea that they're not that political with a capital P.
No, and I think this Pope is very political. As I think he said on his African tour, he's come out and said it's wrong for billionaires or billions to be spent on wars for political aims. Well, who could he be referring to? And so he didn't pull back either. I think he's out there and he's willing also to make pretty political statements.
Yeah. I mean, I think Donald Trump can't resist sort of responding when criticised. That's part of the issue here. A lot of leaders would just, move on, let the Pope say what he wants to say, and not pick a fight in that way. Donald Trump has this itch he has to scratch when whoever he's criticised by, that could be anyone. It's, could be a soap opera actor one day, it can be the Pope the next. He can't resist. And of course, he has all. This is not his first clash. He's also posted pictures of himself as the Pope. AI generated pictures of himself as the Pope. So, and we saw those messages, didn't we, the other day? Praise be to Allah, and all these kind of bellicose truth social. So he doesn't mind sort of really getting stuck into that kind of religious rhetoric and taking on religious figures.
Or the itch, look at the Keir Starmer comments, just when you think he can't say it again, then he does. The Keir Starmer's no Churchill or disappointment in the British Navy or, this is an itch that keeps being scratched as well by Donald Trump.
Right. It's been a very busy Thursday evening in the Newscast studio. Gary, lovely to see you in person.
You too.
And Jane, thanks for coming back too.
Oh, it's great to be here.